Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going straight to the core of cellular specialization. We're taking a deep dive into the really complex biochemistry of red blood cells and platelets. These are the essential components responsible for moving oxygen and, stopping the bleeding.
And this is such a critical chapter for anyone studying human biology or preparing for the health sciences.
Mhm.
What we're really examining today is optimization.
Mm.
How do these specialized cells package an entire life cycle of function into structures that are, well, they're either minimalist gas carriers or these tiny responsive fragments?
Right.
Our mission is to quickly synthesize this knowledge, breaking down the cause and effect logic from, stem cell origins all the way to molecular mechanics.
And the immediate clinical relevance is just huge. I mean, let's look at red blood cells or erythrocytes. They are essentially minimalist delivery trucks, perfectly engineered to package maximum amounts of hemoglobin and the enzyme carbonic anhydrase.
Their entire existence is dedicated to maximizing oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal.
And when that system fails,
Well, when that hyper-efficient system encounters a problem, you get anemia, which is fundamentally a deficiency in circulating hemoglobin.
Mhm.
We usually define that clinically as less than about 120 to 130 grams per liter.
and the causes are all over the map.
They really are. The causes cover a massive spectrum. You might have structural genetic issues, like sickle cell disease, chronic blood loss, or surprisingly common dietary deficiencies like iron or B12.
And you also have pathogens. I'm thinking of the malaria parasite, which physically destroys the cell.
Exactly. It leads to lysis and severe anemia. It's a reminder that even the simplest looking cells have the most complicated vulnerabilities.
Okay, so on the flip side of that circulatory coin, you have platelets.
Right, those tiny fragments that ensure hemostasis, which is just the immediate stop to bleeding. When their count is low, that's thrombocytopenia, and that dramatically increases the risk of hemorrhage.
But the threat isn't just about the number of platelets, right? Sometimes they just fail to do their job, even if the count seems fine.
Exactly. We see genetic disorders, like, say, von Willebrand disease, which affects their ability to stick to the vessel wall, or Glanzmann thrombasthenia, where they can't aggregate with other platelets. These things compromise the protective clot. The biochemistry we are about to discuss really dictates whether these critical functions succeed or fail.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The source. Where do these constantly replaced cellular machines come from?
They originate in the bone marrow from what are called hematopoietic stem cells, or HSCs.
Yeah.
You can think of it as a perpetual construction site because both RBCs and platelets have a really high turnover rate. I mean, the average lifespan of an RBC is only 120 days,
Which requires a constant output of new cells.
a constant output. And these stem cells are so powerful because they have two key abilities.
Mm.
Self-renewal, meaning they can produce unaltered copies of themselves.
And potency, their ability to generate specialized types.
Exactly. And we should put HSCs in context. You have totipotent cells that can produce an entire organism. Pluripotent cells can form the three germ layers. HSCs, though, are multipotent. They're restricted to producing only the specialized cells of the blood lineage.
And that differentiation process, it isn't random. It's a carefully orchestrated cascade regulated by cytokines, right?
Yes, chemical signaling proteins. You have interleukins 1, 3, and 6, along with stem cell factor that sort of get the proliferation started. But then these highly specific hormonal signals come in and deliver the final marching orders.
And these specific directives are crucial.
Oh, they're critical regulatory points. For example, erythropoietin, or EPO, is a glycoprotein made mostly by the kidney, usually in response to low oxygen. EPO specifically drives progenitor cells down the erythrocyte path. In contrast, you have thrombopoietin, or TPO, which directs the formation of platelets. And platelets, interestingly, aren't whole cells at all. They're fragments that bud off from these huge precursor cells called megakaryocytes.
So once EPO has set an erythrocyte on its path, it undergoes this astonishing transformation, becoming what you called a minimalist machine. Why did evolution decide the RBC needed to chuck out so much of its internal furniture?
It was a trade-off, an efficiency trade-off. To optimize the cell for maximum gas transport, mature RBCs literally jettison the nucleus, the Golgi, lysosomes, and, critically, the mitochondria. They cleared house to achieve an astonishingly high internal concentration of hemoglobin.
And how concentrated are we talking, practically?
Hemoglobin makes up about 1/3 of the cell's weight. That's between 30 and 34 grams per deciliter. That optimization is why the cell can't reproduce, can't synthesize new proteins, or really repair itself beyond its basic mechanisms.
And its physical form is essential too. We always talk about that biconcave disc shape. What's the function there?
It gives the cell its resilience and its efficiency. First, that sunken center maximizes the surface area to volume ratio, which speeds up gas exchange exponentially. Second, and this is where the resilience comes in, the shape allows the cell to fold completely over on itself. That lets it squeeze through capillaries that are actually narrower than the cell's own diameter. It's the internal scaffolding that has to absorb all that mechanical stress.
Okay, building on that, let's unpack the cell's energy system. This seems like a huge biochemical bottleneck. Since the RBC lacks mitochondria, how is it generating the ATP it needs for things like ion gradients and membrane pumps?
It relies entirely on glycolysis. It cannot use the TCA cycle, the electron transport chain, or utilize fatty acids or ketone bodies. None of it. Glycolysis, which produces lactate as a waste product, is the only game in town for ATP.
And how does the glucose get in?
It uses facilitated diffusion through glucose transporter 1, or GLUT1. And GLUT1 is always working. It's not regulated by insulin.
And speaking of glycolysis, the RBC runs this unique side branch, a shunt, that lets it fine-tune its oxygen affinity. This involves 2.3 BPG.
Yes, this is a fascinating layer of regulation. The glycolytic intermediate 1.3 bisphosphoglycerate gets shunted away and isomerized to 2.3 BPG by an enzyme called 2.3 BPG mutase.
And why is that so important?
Because 2.3 BPG binds directly to hemoglobin and stabilizes its T state, the tense conformation. This actually decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, so the cell can sense things like pH changes, adjust the 2.3 BPG level, and make sure oxygens are released efficiently right where tissues need it most.
So that shunt makes sure the oxygen gets dumped where it needs to go, but the RBC is also a waste management specialist dealing with all the CO2.
Exactly. CO2 is produced metabolically, but its solubility in plasma is pretty low. So the RBC is equipped with extremely high levels of carbonic anhydrase, or Ca. It acts as a supercatalyst, rapidly converting CO2 into carbonic acid and then bicarbonate. This is key because roughly 80% of waste CO2 is transported as dissolved carbonic acid and bicarbonate.
Okay, so once that bicarbonate is formed inside the cell, it has to get out into the plasma to get to the lungs. How does it manage that?
That is the job of band 3. Band 3 is this essential integral membrane protein that functions as the key anion exchanger. It facilitates moving that bicarbonate waste out of the cell and into the plasma, but to maintain electrical neutrality, it simultaneously swaps a chloride ion into the cell. It's an antiport system that is absolutely critical for efficient CO2 removal.
So if energy production is the bottleneck, the cell's Achilles heel has to be the constant battle against oxidation. The ferrous iron in hemoglobin, F2 plus A, is always at risk of being oxidized by reactive oxygen species, ROS.
This is the constant crisis the cell faces. When that Fu2 plus is oxidized to the ferric state, F3 plus Ep, it forms methemoglobin, and ferric iron cannot bind oxygen, which makes that hemoglobin molecule totally useless.
But the cell has a fix for this.
It does. It has an emergency recycling system that runs constantly to fix this.
The methemoglobin rescue pathway. How does it manage to reduce that non-functional iron back to its active state?
It uses the NADH-cytochrome by 5 methemoglobin reductase system. So remember that NADH we made from glycolysis?
Right.
It transfers electrons via a flavoprotein called cytochrome by 5 reductase to another protein, cytochrome B5. Then that reduced cytochrome by 5 hands the electrons directly to the methemoglobin, reducing the inactive F3 plus back to functional oxygen-binding F2 plus dono. The whole mechanism relies on a constant supply of NADH from glycolysis.
And if that system fails, or if you introduce drugs that generate too much ROS, you get methemoglobinemia, too much inactive hemoglobin, which results in the patient turning cyanotic.
Exactly. Methemoglobinemia can be acquired, often through drug exposure like certain anesthetics or sulfonamides, or it can be inherited, usually through a genetic deficiency in the cytochrome by 5 reductase enzyme itself.
But that's just the rescue pathway for iron. The general cellular defense against overall oxidative stress relies on a different axis entirely. And this is where it gets really clinically impactful. We're talking about glucose 6, phosphate dehydrogenase, G6PD.
Yes. We've established that RBCs are vulnerable. To neutralize generalized oxidative damage, they use enzymes like superoxide dismutase and glutathione peroxidase. But the fuel for these enzymes, the reducing power, that has to come from NADPH. And NADPH is supplied by G6PD via the pentose phosphate pathway.
And G6PD deficiency. This isn't some niche diagnosis. It's recognized as the most common enzymopathy globally. I think it affects over 400 million people.
The clinical significance is just staggering. If you lack G6PD, you lack NADPH. Without NADPH, you can't regenerate reduced glutathione or GSH, and GSH is the primary molecule used to neutralize harmful peroxides. This failure of the antioxidant shield causes massive oxidative stress, damaging both the cell membrane and the hemoglobin itself.
And when the hemoglobin is damaged, what do you see inside the cell?
It aggregates into these structures called Heinz bodies. These inclusions damage the cell membrane even more, making the RBC rigid and dysfunctional. The result is acute hemolytic anemia, often triggered by stress, certain foods, or drugs. It's also one of evolution's most brilliant yet painful trade-offs, since the deficiency is thought to confer protection against malaria.
That structural resilience is so key. Okay, let's pivot from internal pathways to external structure. For the cell to maintain that biconcave disc and withstand all that squeezing for 120 days, it needs some kind of internal shock absorber system.
That's a great analogy. It needs strength and flexibility, and that's provided by a dense internal cytoskeletal meshwork right beneath the lipid bilayer. The main structural component making up about 75% of this mesh is spectrin. Spectrin forms these long, intertwined heterotetramers that provide the flexible foundation.
And what anchors that spectrin scaffolding to the actual membrane?
It's a three-part anchoring system. The primary anchor is a protein called ankyrin, which binds spectrin and then connects it tightly to the integral membrane protein, band 3.
Wait, the same band 3 that runs the bicarbonate exchange.
The very same one. So band 3 is the critical bridge connecting external membrane function to the internal cytoskeleton. Then you have actin, or band 5, and protein 4.1, which form an accessory complex with spectrin, further anchoring the mesh to other integral proteins, specifically the glycophorins. It's a beautifully complex network designed for mechanical stress.
So if you have a defect in any one of those components, the cell loses its ability to handle that stress.
And it leads directly to hemolytic disorders. In hereditary spherocytosis, the core issue is often a deficiency in spectrin or ankyrin, or sometimes defects in band 3 or 4.1. Because the anchor links are weakened, the RBC loses its ability to deform, it swells into a non-flexible sphere, a spherocyte, and gets prematurely destroyed by the spleen. Hereditary elliptosyrmposis is a similar failure of the meshwork, just resulting in an oval or elliptic shape.
So structural integrity dictates the cell's lifespan, but the Cerdis markers dictate its identity. Let's talk about the elegant molecular basis of the ABO blood group system.
Right. These are specific complex oligosaccharides sugars that are attached to glycosphingolipids on the RBC surface. The foundational platform for all blood types is a precursor molecule called the H substance. This H substance is formed by a fucosyltransferase enzyme coded by the H locus.
So H substance is the base, and A and B types are just adding a different sugar flag to that base.
Precisely. If you have the A gene, it codes for a specific GalNAc transferase enzyme. That enzyme adds N-acetylgalactosamine to the H substance. That N-acetylgalactosamine is the A antigen. It's what anti-A antibodies target. The B gene codes for a Gal transferase that adds galactose.
And if you're type O?
The O gene is actually a frameshift mutation that results in an inactive enzyme. So only the H substance is present on the surface. And that absence of A or B sugars is what makes type O the universal donor. It lacks those primary targets for host antibodies.
We should probably also mention the rare exception, the Bombay phenotype.
Oh, yes. The Bombay phenotype, or O, really highlights why the H substance is so foundational. In people with a homozygous HH genotype, the fucosyltransferase is inactive. They can't form the H substance in the first place. So since the A and B enzymes have nothing to attach their sugars to, the resulting phenotype is functionally type O, even if they genetically possess the A or B genes.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the second key cell in this chapter, platelets and hemostasis. Like RBCs, platelets lack a nucleus, but they have some key biochemical differences.
For one, they're tiny, about 2 micrometers in diameter. We know they're fragments of megakaryocytes regulated by TPO. Crucially, unlike RBCs, they do have mitochondria. So while they use glucose for most of their energy, they can also perform beta-oxidation of fatty acids. They are designed for one thing: rapid, decisive action.
And that action requires a well-stocked storage cabinet.
Indeed. They have 2 main types of secretory vesicles. The dense granules hold critical small molecules like calcium, ADP, which is a potent signaling molecule, and serotonin. Then the alpha granules hold the big players: structural proteins like fibrinogen, fibronectin, growth factors like PDGF, and von Willebrand factor, all ready for immediate release.
And just as with RBCs, failure leads to serious problems. We covered low-count thrombocytopenia, but let's quickly clarify how function defects manifest.
Right. When function is impaired, clotting fails. For example, immune thrombocytopenic purpura, or ITP, is an autoimmune condition where antibodies mark platelets for clearance, dropping the count. But genetically, we see very specific protein failures.
The adherence disorders are a perfect illustration of that cause and effect.
They are. Von Willebrand disease is a defect in the primary adherence, so platelets can't stick properly to the exposed collagen in the vessel wall. Bernard-Soulier syndrome is a deficiency of glycoprotein AB, compromising adherence. And Glanzmann thrombasthenia is a deficiency of the glycoprotein IBA complex. And that complex is required for platelets to aggregate and stick to each other to build the final plug.
That covers the full spectrum. So let's summarize the 3 absolute key takeaways you need to lock in from this material.
Okay, focus on these concepts above all else.
1. Red blood cells are fundamentally ATP-dependent glycolytic engines. Their entire minimalist, design-lacking organelles, especially mitochondria, is a specialized trade-off to maximize hemoglobin concentration.
2. The G-cis-PD and ADPH glutathione pathway is the primary biochemical axis providing defense against overwhelming oxidative stress. Its failure results in hemolytic anemia linked to Heinz bodies.
And 3. Cytoskeletal integrity. Specifically, that anchoring network built by spectrin, ankyrin, and band 3 is the key structural requirement that allows the RBC to maintain its shape and survive its 120-day commute.
So what does this all mean? Well, understanding the molecular regulation of blood cell production gives us profound therapeutic control. For instance, knowing that EPO controls erythrocyte production allowed us to develop recombinant DNA technology to synthesize EPO. It's now routinely used to treat anemia in patients with chronic kidney failure. These discoveries fundamentally change patient outcomes.
That's progress you can measure in lives saved. But let's leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We detailed this elegant evolutionary compromise. The RBC survives for only 120 days because it jettisoned its nucleus and mitochondria to maximize gas carrying capacity. How does that trade off a relatively short life for an optimized cell compared to the energy and space trade-offs that would be required for a larger self-repairing cell that could live longer but would carry significantly less oxygen?
Something to ponder as you connect the biochemistry to the physiology.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into red blood cells and platelets, and a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.